So I could make this really short and say what Jeff said. We're dealing with the exact same thing here in Alberta, and I feel like we're always maybe a step behind BC, but we're catching up. And in the last 2 years, we've had a pretty good mandate from this government and an opportunity to catch up as much as we can. So, and I'm wondering, is there a prize for the longest virtual commute? I'm in Sherwood Park, which is just east of Edmonton. And so I want to acknowledge that I'm on the Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So this mural greets my kids at the front entry of their school, and it was created in consultation with a local elder, Wilson Barehead and Kyla Sorrell, who provide teaching and Indigenous supports for the school. So I've been here for 6 years in Sherwood Park, working for the government of Alberta. I'm a recreation planning lead with Alberta Environment and Parks. But before that, I was on the Crown of the Continent working for Cows and Fish for 12 years out of Calgary. So I worked with many of the local ranchers, municipalities, and recreation organizations in the Crown of the Continent. And I actually started my career with the government of Alberta in public lands, conducting vegetation inventories in grazing allotments, mostly in southern Alberta. The Crown's a beautiful place. It's hard to pick a favorite spot, but I think one of my favorite experiences when I was in those early days of veg inventories was hopping back and forth across a barbed wire fence on the south end of Polehaven. So I was, on one side, I'm in Canada, I'm in the US, and now I'm back in Canada. So I got to experience some of those pretty amazing landscapes. And I think we learned a little bit yesterday in our interactive session about how even well-meaning visitors can cause havoc in a recreation planning exercise. And I think most people would agree that the trends we've seen over the past 2 years will only continue, even with the easing of travel restrictions. And as Brad Jones mentioned on Tuesday, Alberta hasn't historically been in the business of recreation management prior to this Trails Act initiative. So liability concerns on public lands, or government liability, and a lack of dedicated resources has pushed much needed improvements on public land recreation to the back burner. And so, we learned when I found out that Jeff was providing his presentation on Kukanusa, I had to quickly throw in a slide from Kukanusa. This is a long time ago, our trip, to that area. And I'd be interested to go back and see how those trails have changed, and if this, spot where we were, our kids were riding our dirt bikes next to our campground, if it's become a designated trail or not. So I think, as mentioned, the lack of recreation management and resources in our department, but really that hasn't stopped people from accessing public land for a whole variety of recreation activities. Alberta is a bit unique, I think, compared to many other jurisdictions, in that it has plenty of ways to access the backcountry, especially as we move further north in the province, thanks to the legacy of industrial exploration, resulting in a patchwork of hundreds of thousands of unplanned and unmanaged trails. Our department has had pretty limited tools previously to manage trails on public land. One of those is through the creation of a public land use zone. And most of the Crown of the Continent in Alberta is covered off by public land use zones. So that helps in this area. And the other way that we could help manage trails on public land was to designate a trail as a public land recreation trail through an order in council. So yeah, we had to go to the highest level of government for a decision to designate a trail. So not surprisingly, we only have 5 public land recreation trails in the province designated. We are able to designate trails and public land use zones through signs and notices, but those tools are not available to government on the rest of public land. And we haven't made it easy for our partners to help us, despite their enthusiasm to do so. Recreation has been perceived as a low priority item for government, and we've had a lack of resources and staff to support our trail volunteers and stewardship projects. It's been a long and winding road to get to a Trails Act, and it's not Alberta's first kick at it. Yesterday, we met with the Climbers Access Society of Alberta to talk about the Trails Act and implementation. And their president told me that when he was thinking about who to make sure he invited to the meeting, he did a search through his emails on the Trails Act and found a CASA board email dated 2011 discussing a meeting with then Minister Christine Cusinelli, where the Trails Act was essentially ready to bring to the legislature. So his reaction was, "My, what a long, strange trip it has been with Trails Act." But this time around, we had a clear mandate, as I mentioned, and marching orders from our government's platform commitment, which was to introduce an Alberta Trails Act to increase awareness about and encourage the sustainable use of trails, enhance trails and trail experiences, and protect trails for future generations. Before we could launch into developing a Trails Act, we needed a vision, a Crown land vision, which at the time felt like it could have been a costly delay. As everyone knows, things move slowly, and we only had so much time to get this in place, according to our government timelines of the day. But it did actually help everyone get on the same page. One of the pillars in this common sense conservation plan was a commitment to move forward with sustainable funding and partnerships for recreation. So once that vision was in place, we launched engagement for sustainable recreation. And this included a public survey, a stakeholder discussion guide, and Indigenous consultation. And we wrapped up that engagement in early last year, 2021, but we still weren't quite ready for a Trails Act. We needed some legislative changes that were introduced last spring and allowed the department to collect fees for activities on public land, which we didn't have the ability to do before. So charging a fee would finally bring Alberta into alignment with many other jurisdictions across Canada and the US that apply user fees to various types of recreation on public land. So we introduced the Kananaskis Conservation Pass, which covers a lot of the parks and public land west of Calgary in Kananaskis country, and the public land camping pass, which is a rather unique. So that's applied to random camping, as Jeff was talking about, or that dispersed camping, which tends not to be very random at all. And so a $30 annual fee was required to camp on public land. So pretty low cost of entry, but still helps build that a bit of a fund there and build the capacity of the department to manage recreation and to direct funding back to user groups and organizations acting in the interest of the department. And those are the types of groups that are already doing their part to help maintain and improve public lands. So as Kelly mentioned yesterday, the government recently approved the Alberta Trails Act. And so one of the key things that the Trails Act did was to provide that clear mandate for the department to invest in and manage outdoor recreation. So I guess now we are in the business of managing recreation on public land. So it's meant to recognize the important contribution of trails to environmental, economic, and social outcomes, including our well-being through being active and connecting with nature. So I think as one of our key partners, the Bragg Creek Trails Association best put it, this finally puts trails on a level playing field with other land uses, such as logging, oil and gas, and cattle grazing. So now as a department, we have the ability to designate, protect, and manage recreation trails and recreation-related infrastructure across all public lands. The Trails Act, as a construct and a system, aims to put that planning system in place that will allow us to grow trail opportunities while conserving ecologically and culturally important areas. As I mentioned, we already had some of these tools available in public land use zones, but those mostly just cover the eastern slopes and not all of the foothills, important areas along the Rocky Mountains in Alberta. And the public land use zones were predominantly focused on managing motorized access. And now we're currently exploring designating non-motorized trails, within public land use zones as well. And these non-motorized trails also have significant recreation infrastructure investments and are important to recognize and protect, such as the Great Divide Trail that was mentioned by Kelly yesterday, and also mountain bike trails, such as those in Moose Mountain. But the Trails Act is definitely not a panacea. It's not going to immediately put an effective trail system and recreation management approach in place tomorrow. It's about putting that system in place for a thoughtful approach to trails. New trails will be designated once a trail management planning process has taken place and we have that approved trail plan approved by the department. The intent is that we move towards trails that are planned in consideration of other land uses and values. A trail management plan helps us ensure trails are located in the appropriate places, provide desirable recreation experiences. They help identify the type of recreation activity and are also meant to address environmental considerations, such as the location of watercourse crossings. And the key is also that they provide an opportunity for engagement. The other component of this is building trails. Trail standards that are being developed are directions to trail managers about the construction, maintenance, and reclamation of designated trails. We have much of this approach outlined in our trail design guidelines for Alberta. But a component of that guideline will form a standard for trail managers, so that if they're following these standards for basic trail maintenance, they don't need to come to the department for authorization every time they need to clear a tree from the trail, which was the case before, and was quite a barrier to groups being able to do work on behalf of the department on public land trails. And as I mentioned, we recognize that there's a large investment of time and financial resources by recreation groups and organizations into trails on public land. And those trails need to be protected in order for groups and tourism opportunities to have confidence in that trail being there into the future. This legislation requires that trails are repaired if they are damaged by other uses, such as industrial activities, while continuing to enable those types of land uses and commitments. Our industrial partners, such as forestry and oil and gas, generally work quite well with trail managers to avoid impacts. But sometimes they don't, and sometimes they don't know the trail is there until they arrive on site to do their work. Recreation trail might inadvertently become a coal exploration road. So these designated trails will show up in the landscape analysis tool. And this is a tool that industry uses and is required to consult for understanding the other interests in the area. So this protection of trails and recognition of trails on the landscape will help, but I don't think it will completely solve kind of a long-standing problem of where historically a traditional Indigenous trail might become a livestock trail, which becomes an off-highway vehicle trail, becomes a temporary harvest road, and gets rolled back and reclaimed. But that's a bigger issue for us to tackle, but something we need to be cognizant of is how these trails came into being. And the Trails Act also wants to help better enable our partners and partnerships. They've made many contributions over the years to trail and recreation management, and the intent is to better enable those by working with partners to draw on their expertise and energy. So as I mentioned, this includes streamlining how basic trail maintenance activities, such as clearing brush and debris from trails, can be done. And the last component of this system is monitoring. And, we can do some of that ourselves as the department. AEP by default is the trail manager. But where we have a willing partner on the landscape, we can enter into a trail agreement with that partner. And then that trail manager has the ability to do those basic maintenance activities, do trail monitoring with direction from the department, can close trails for work or restoration as needed. So that's the general framework and the system that's been been put in place by Trails Act. So we have all these shiny new tools at our fingertips, but now we need policies and guides on how to best use them effectively and consistently across Alberta's public lands. So we have much work to do with partners, many policies, guides to help implement the approach. And based on the presentation we had this morning, it sounds like we might need to add some guidebooks, perhaps, on visitor use management, as that's another tool that definitely needs sharpening in our toolbox. As I mentioned, there's lots left to do, but I'm happy to take any questions that folks might have on this new approach.
Thank you, Amanda. Do we have any questions here for Amanda? Does anyone have a question they would like to ask directly? I saw
Kelly has a question.
Oh, thank you. I can't see everyone's hand here. It's Kelly, go ahead.
Or in the chat.
Oh, is it in the chat? Sorry. I can't see everyone's hand because
So Kelly asked, plan, build, manage, and monitor. Where does enforcement fit into this question? Yeah, that's definitely a key piece. So boots on the ground was another platform commitment. So that's something we were more than happy to improve in the regulations. So we have added fines for the different activities. So now that we can enforce trail activity types on all public lands, we have fines associated with those rules. We've increased the fine for recreation related garbage on public land, and also have the ability to seize vehicles now for some of the more egregious offenses like wheels in water. So it's not only having that presence, so more conservation officers on the landscape, it's having an effective enough deterrent that people really don't want to encounter that conservation officer. So we've beefed up their arsenal a little bit, hired a few more conservation officers, and hopefully we'll see more effective enforcement on the landscape.
Thank you, Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any more. Oh, there was one question from Benjamin. Will the lack of permitting authorization only apply to trail maintenance, or will it also apply to trail construction? Just trail maintenance. Yeah. So new trails, if you're constructing a trail, there's especially if there's any watercourse crossings involved, there's other acts and authorizations that are needed. So yeah, basic trail maintenance, can go ahead and do, once there's an agreement, can go ahead and do those activities, but new trails will still require authorization.